Oh yeah, 360! I don't know why I decided to go immediately from Heavenly Sword to Enslaved. I probably just wanted to get the Ninja Theory games over and done with. It's really nice that Ninja Theory actually succeeded in making a better game this time around. Enslaved fixes a lot of the problems I said that Heavenly Sword had. You know, it's got better character progression systems, more combat options, and enemy behaviors. They're all vastly superior. You know, you have a currency, and you have the ability to pick and choose which upgrades you can get, which is great. It's way better than what they had in Heavenly Sword. Unfortunately, like Heavenly Sword, the combo system is kind of just one note though. You're stuck just button mashing. I mostly spam the faster attack button to charge up focused attacks faster. Focused attacks are primarily how I did most of my killing of the lesser enemies. The combat is better, but enemies feel like they have far too much health. Hitting enemies charges focused attacks, and you can unleash them when fully charged. Focused attacks are essentially a one-hit kill to most lesser enemies and deal a significant amount to the larger ones. You have a few more options like a stun attack, which can break enemy shields and stun them. The various extra moves you get are kind of worthless, honestly. Stun charge is useful, counter and evade attacks I didn't really use. You also have a range attack that deals a lot of damage, but it has a pretty limited ammo capacity. You're forced to do some third-person shooting in dedicated sections, but you can use it even during standard combat, but ammo, like I said, is fairly limited. I would strongly recommend you get focused attack as soon as possible. There are a few upgrades that can be useful, like combat awareness. The combat awareness color codes your enemies based on whether they're attacking or defending. It's so cheap that they may as well have just made it free to show you how the upgrade system works, or just have had it active from the beginning. The charged stun upgrade can be useful depending on your playstyle, but others are hit and miss. Unfortunately, there's no damage upgrade to your basic attacks, which would have been welcome. Like I said, the invade and counter attacks I basically didn't touch. I didn't really upgrade any of the range abilities in my playthrough, but if you're going to play Enslaved, I would strongly suggest that you do. There are a few sections where you absolutely have to kill enemies using ranged attacks, and having the additional ammo capacity and damage would have been quite useful. Likewise, there are things that sound good on paper, but you can safely avoid. Fire rate for ranged attacks is probably useless. I didn't really need to touch health much, and the same thing with blocking, it's just not very useful. This is mostly because you have a temporary damage shield that regenerates slowly over time, and in conjunction with the slow health regeneration upgrade, you can basically survive a lot of battles through sheer attrition. So a lot of his stuff is better, but at the same time, a lot of it is just kinda, eh. There's a lot of different components in Enslaved, much like Heavenly Sword. There's nothing as bad as the forced aftertouch in really stale combat, but most of the components are generally uninteresting. For whatever reason, Ninja Theory loves turret sections. There are many in Enslaved. I haven't gotten to the DMC remake yet, but I wouldn't even be remotely surprised if there was a turret section in that as well. I guess turret sections are just an easy to grasp and simple thing, but they're really boring, and especially in these Ninja Theory games, they often feel completely out of place. There are a lot of sequences on the cloud as well. The cloud is pretty slippery to control, and you're often forced to avoid arbitrarily placed mines, which isn't really that fun. It's kind of funny because Monkey justifies the cloud sections with some throwaway piece of dialogue. You know, he says, "It's a cloud. I don't know how it works, but it only works in certain places." You know, then you got Trip asking if she can get on, and Monkey replies with, "There's only room for one." You know, that's a bit insulting, because you often have to carry Trip around to no detriment to your speed or agility. The whole idea of having to use the cloud to navigate certain areas to get Trip across is kind of annoying, when you should just be able to pick up Trip, get on the cloud, and go wherever you need to go. The cloud sections are actually not terrible, but it'd be kind of cool if you actually use it whenever you wanted, instead of the super obvious open areas it chooses to let you use it. It feels like the cloud is in there exclusively because of the loose ties to the Chinese journey to the west. You know, then there's the on-rails climbing. Enslaved is the first game I'm talking about that has this, but it definitely won't be the last by any stretch. It's just a really mindless level traversal mechanic. Some games do it well by giving you some illusion of control with how you traverse the area, but most of them you have one set path and you have to do everything exactly as the developer intended. Enslaved's climbing is incredibly on rails, and it's mindless. So in the beginning of Enslaved, you're really pushed down this line of using Trip's abilities in conjunction with Monkey's abilities to progress through the areas. This usually manifests as using Trip as a distraction while you move up, and then acting as a distraction for Trip so she can move up. The game kind of loses that emphasis as it goes on. Toward the end, it feels like they forgot this developed mechanic between Monkey and Trip. Then it goes full on action and mindless climbing. Trip also doesn't really gain any other abilities throughout the game. She has distraction and some occasional things like Monkey being able to tell her to pull levers at certain times. She has the ability to heal Monkey, but if you upgrade health regeneration once, that becomes completely worthless. The only real ability she gains throughout the game is the Dragonfly Scout, and that's always used at the start of a new area and you have no control over it whatsoever. So you can't really control what Trip does besides a distraction, and everything else is fairly automated or scripted set pieces. I feel like they should have really emphasized using Monkey in conjunction with Trip to navigate levels, and they just kind of fall into this really obvious routine after a while. Ninja Theory definitely stepped up their game. They're obviously pretty talented with production values, art direction, getting good actors, and having reasonable directors for the story. The problem they have is they just can't really make a good game. They'd probably be better served making movies, honestly, but then again, their stories are usually marred with some really glaring flaws. Anything climbable in Enslaved has this really obnoxious and obvious shine to it. A lot of modern games with on-rails climbing segments mark what is climbable, usually by a specific color. The Tomb Raider remake uses white. Uncharted uses yellow for the most part. It's usually a more elegant way of doing it rather than having the object shine and flash. The shine breaks the art style, and it makes it feel mindless navigating around because you can immediately see where the game wants you to start climbing and the intended route. There are also really blatant things like the target reticles on the final boss that just look terrible aesthetically, and again, make it completely mindless. You don't have to visually find the weak spot, you just aim for the giant crosshair that they've provided for you. You know, there are some other things that I really dislike though. Enslaved is actually really obnoxious about showing you the same animations over and over again. There's only a handful of combat takedowns and you end up seeing them all the time. Every kill on the last enemy in a group has this zoomed in shot of Monkey's grimacing face in slow motion, which gets really old really fast. That isn't that terrible though. There is one that really rubs me the wrong way though, and it's because of how blatant they are about reusing them and showing them to you constantly. It's Monkey throwing Trip up onto these bars. It always shows the exact same animation every time you do it, and I think it just looks awful. The way Trip scrambles up looks so rushed and terrible that I think they try to mask how bad it looks, but you're always forced to watch a close-up of it. There are less obvious ones, like Monkey climbing up something that's an overhang, but they're all the same, and they're all equally annoying to watch. It happens constantly, and they're always the same, and so blatant about it, that it makes it really hard to care. They force you to watch them, and they frequently zoom in on them, which gives you ample time to realize how terrible it all looks. Again, like Heavenly Sword, I think they were just really proud of their work and wanted to show it off. Enslaved has moments where you can come across what looks like a skull or a mask. You know, Monkey describes these as a glitch in the slave crown. They're usually just something completely ordinary and nothing we haven't seen before. You know, it's things like pictures of a family, people riding horses, very ordinary, everyday things. It's obviously meant to foreshadow the ending, and these images would be foreign to Monkey, but since they're so ordinary to us, they have no impact at all. When I first played, I honestly thought they were just Easter eggs from the developers. You know, I thought it was, showing pictures of the developers' families and stuff, but it's not. I like quite a bit of the music tracks, actually, but it's got the same problem as Heavenly Sword, where a lot of the time the sound will just kind of cut out, or it'll wash out. It's just kind of sloppy and lacks the polish you'd expect from a big game release. Enslaved's combat has a very zoomed up camera. It makes combat more cinematic than functional. It's really apparent when you're using things like the stun charge, which zooms in directly behind Monkey where you can easily lose track of where the enemies are. Once the zoom in happens, it usually takes a little bit for the game to remember to zoom back out and adjust to the normal camera. It can make combat needlessly difficult, especially when you're against multiple enemies in a tight space. It makes it really hard to keep track of all the enemies on the battlefield, and it can sometimes lead to you getting smacked from seemingly nowhere. Sometimes when you perform a takedown on certain enemies, the camera is so zoomed up that it's actually hard to see what Monkey's doing. Honestly, Enslaved isn't that difficult, so the camera thing is a minor gripe, but that flaw in the camera perspective is just really annoying. Enslaved is pretty easy overall. You don't really get much more difficult enemies, it's just kind of more of them. Your upgrades are mostly just survivability. And, you know, that's kind of weird because, you know, you've got a temporary damage shield, and Trip can heal you, and you can unlock slow health regeneration. There's health packs around. It's just kind of like, eh. So honestly, it's probably pretty hard to say exactly what the hardest part was. You know, the boss fights versus the dogs are basically a complete joke once you understand that you can keep them completely locked down with plasma ammo or a well-timed stun attack. You know, the finale isn't very challenging. It's mostly just, you know, some third-person shooting. The part that's probably the most difficult is any part you're flying around on the cloud and you need to avoid mines. The cloud is inherently slippery to control, and you need to do some fairly precise maneuvering around minefields. The minefields are what I would consider to be far too densely packed and have a huge trigger area. Hitting a mine is an instant kill, which can make navigating through them pretty annoying. Turret sections can be kind of a pain in the ass as well, mostly the one on the boat to Pigsy's. You know, I'd say the length is about right, but it does feel a little long, especially after the first half, and definitely at the very end. On paper, you know, it's 7 hours, which doesn't seem like it would be too long, but the second half just takes a huge nosedive in terms of the pacing. The big end goal is getting to Trip's village, and the journey getting there feels pretty good. Then after you get there, you go on this second quest, which feels like an absolute slog. It just kept going, and it all felt mostly meaningless. You know, you get to Pigsy, you get to Trip's friend Pigsy's place, then you go hunting for scrap, then you have to go hunt more scrap, and then even more scrap. Then you get to an underground base, you find some giant mech, you go inside to turn the giant mech on, you do a bunch of stuff inside the mech, you know, you finally activate it, and then you start going after Pyramid, where there's one final battle. It feels so much longer and drawn out than it needed to be. If you cut out all that, and you just had Monkey and Trip going on another journey to Pyramid, I think it would have been a much better game overall. So the game starts off with Monkey in a cage. He's apparently been captured by a slave ship that's being controlled by Pyramid. Across the room, Trip is also on the ship, and she hacks her way out of her cell. After that, Monkey breaks out of his cell and manages to get onto Trip's escape pod before the ship crashes. Monkey wakes up only to find that Trip has put a hacked slave crown on him, and he now has to do everything that she says. And Trip wants Monkey to take her home. Trip and Monkey go through quite a few areas, and they begin to develop a friendship and partnership. Eventually they reach Trip's home, only to find that it's been attacked and taken over by Pyramid mechs. So Trip stupidly runs off on her own, and Monkey has to go through quite a bit to actually hunt her down and find her. Then the game switches gears, and you're going after Pyramid. So you meet up with one of Trip's father's friends, Pigsy, who has a creepy crush on Trip. You hunt scrap for what feels like hours to get components to activate a giant mech. You go to an underground base where the mech's being held, you find it, you activate it, and you steal it. Then you ride the mech to Pyramid, fight some of the defenses, and Pigsy makes the ultimate sacrifice, which has no impact because he was a huge asshole to you, a general burden on you, a creep, and a general unlikable mess. Trip and Monkey enter Pyramid to find that they've been enslaving people to put them into a virtual reality that's based on our modern world, a la the Matrix. Monkey accepts the invitation to see what the world is like, but Trip loses her shit and kills the guy who's holding it all together. Everyone gets released from this better virtual reality and now has to live their lives in this shitty post-apocalyptic world. Then the game fades to black. As far as I can tell, this story has very little, if anything, to do with the Chinese myth. The only ties I can see immediately are Monkey being loosely based on Sun Wukong with his design and abilities like the staff and the cloud, and Pigsy being loosely based on Zhu Baji, most likely in name and appearance only. There is a journey aspect, but the Chinese myth is more of a pilgrimage. The three protectors are assigned to protect the monk as a way to atone for their sins. Now, Monkey, as far as I can tell, isn't some sinner. He's just a regular guy who Trip enslaves because it's convenient for her. Pigsy only comes along because he's in love with Trip. The ties are so loose that I think it shouldn't have even bothered making them. You can have all the aspects of Sun Wukong and Monkey like the staff and the cloud without needing to reference the story directly in your game's title. Although most people would probably assume they were referencing Goku from Dragon Ball if they did that. I just think it didn't need the references. It's a journey. basically a journey to get Trip home, and it has nothing to do with the Chinese myth, so it's just kind of like, In general, I prefer games where you have a clear-cut end goal, and you know exactly what you're working towards from the beginning. That's why I like games like Chrono Trigger and Demon Souls. They have a very, very clear-cut end goal, and they work very well. Enslaved starts this way, with your end goal clearly being to get Trip home. Monkey is dragged along against his will because of a slave crown, but then he reaches a point where he'd continue going on regardless of the slave crown, because he's found some purpose and friendship with Trip. It means you can make the story about the journey, and the characters developing together in this forced partnership turned friendship. So once you get Trip back home and you find it's destroyed, you know you're just going to go on some tacked-on revenge quest, and it just doesn't really work. The first part of Enslaved is significantly more enjoyable than the second. Getting to Trip's home is fun, and there's a lot of really subtle character interaction and growth. Although I do think they kind of develop a bit too fast. Monkey just kind of accepts it and goes with it after the initial shock that Trip gives him. You'd think a handful of those shocks would happen throughout the story. It would have been great if Monkey wanted to go one way, but Trip wanted to go the other, so then Trip used it to force Monkey that way. You could use that to develop the characters, but they're basically just getting along from the get-go. You can chalk it up to Monkey being a quick learner, I guess. Then after they arrive at Trip's home, the game switches gears and goes into taking out Pyramid, which includes activating a giant war mech, and it just loses focus on what it had going for it because they felt like they needed an epic finale. I'm not going to sit here and say that Enslaved needed a happy ending, with Trip and Monkey getting home and everyone living happily ever after. You can end stories about a journey in an ambiguous way that still have closure, like how The Last of Us ended. The alternative is you continue the same way, but you remove the Pigsy stuff that's kind of tacked on, and you just have Trip and Monkey doing another journey to Pyramid. Then you can develop the characters and their dynamic further, because we're seeing another side of Trip with how she's dealing with her anger and the loss of her father. Then you can have ideas of forgiveness and letting go be present while on this second journey, so when they finally reach Pyramid, Trip doesn't just have a mental breakdown and destroy everything for everyone. So there's one specific scene with Trip and Monkey where Monkey tells Trip to turn the slave crown back on. It feels really, really creepy. So let me put it this way. If the situation was reversed and the slave crown was on Trip with Monkey being in charge, would that be acceptable? No, probably not. I guess the relationship build-up between Monkey and Trip isn't actually that unrealistic. Monkey has been a loner for the majority of his life, and now he's forced to work with someone else, and that relationship develops naturally over the duration of the game. One of the main problems is that Trip breaks her promise to Monkey to let him go when she gets her home. She drags Monkey along in her quest for revenge because she's too weak to do it herself. That makes her very unlikable. If Trip let Monkey go, and then Monkey decided to stay, or maybe he left for a bit and came back to help her out, that could have been some better character development than what we get now, which is basically Trip just lying to Monkey and then forcing him to come with no choice whatsoever. That makes Trip really unlikable. I think it's exactly the same as Nariko in Heavenly Sword. She's an unlikable character, and instead of getting an arc or development, they just do something to garner sympathy. It's a cheap and dirty way to get you to like and sympathize with her. So there's another kind of weird thing, and that's where Trip actually sets the slave ship to self-destruct. And when she was captured, she was no doubt captured around her village. So it's totally possible that she actually inadvertently kills some of her own people who were also enslaved during the raid on her village. It's also hard to believe that she doesn't even register that it's likely that her village was targeted by the slavers, so she acts all surprised when you get back and it's been destroyed. I guess you can chalk that up to being in denial about it. So Trip is really hard to like for a character for one last reason. There's no other way around it. Enslaved's ending is insulting, and it tarnishes the whole game. When we learn that Pyramid is essentially trying to create some kind of paradise-like virtual reality, it opens up a lot of questions, What's real? Is it right to live like that, or is it just escapism? Do we have a right to destroy this for everyone else, even though Pyramid's harmed us?
What are you doing?
A lot of these questions pop up in your head. Monkey at least tries to see what the reality is like before he makes a decision. Trip doesn't. Trip just fucks it up for everyone else. I get it, her father was killed and her home ravaged, but you think that when some revelation like that comes up, you wouldn't just kill some guy about it, you'd actually think for 2 seconds. Kinda goes back to what I was saying, where there's no real time for Trip to accept what happened. You just kinda go to Pigsy and you go get this giant war mech and you go fight. and there's no time to develop Trip's character,
I can explain.
and that doesn't work very well. The idea that Pyramid is forcefully capturing people to put into their Matrix-like reality is like basically the dumbest thing ever. It's established in the beginning that they fry one of the slaves' brains for resisting, which doesn't make any sense if they're trying to get more people into this reality. It does make it seem like in the beginning they had set up Pyramid to be like just straight up an evil corporation organization thing, and they were actually enslaving people. Then they tried to make it smart at the end, and it just kind of fails. In all honesty, Pyramid would just need to go about advertising a little better. Offer people a peaceful alternative instead of sicking mechs on everyone, destroying homes and murdering people in the process, only to force their lifestyle on any captured survivors. It's weak, like I said. Feels like it was tacked on at the last minute because they needed a dramatic conclusion, and they tried to have an artsy ending. It's definitely a step up from Heavenly Sword, but Enslaved just isn't really anything noteworthy. The start of the game is good, right up until you get to Trip's home. Honestly, I would probably strongly consider you just stop playing when you get on the motorcycle. Have it end with some art house ambiguity as you ride off into the sunset. The game doesn't do anything you haven't seen before. If you're well versed in this genre like I am, you'd be constantly looking at gameplay and features and see it was all done better by numerous other games in the past. Your progression systems aren't really satisfying. You're fighting the same handful of enemies the entire game, which makes it pretty boring. You know, it's not bad by any stretch, it's just totally average.
Can you hear me?
Enslaved is really hard to criticize and think about what I would improve upon because I'm basically indifferent to it. I think with the way Enslaved is structured, you really need to hammer in Monkey and Trip's relationship and their dynamic in terms of gameplay. Trip is techie, but she's worthless in terms of any kind of agility in combat, and that's contrasted with Monkey's agility and his brutish strength. I talked about it already in terms of the story, but you can really emphasize that dynamic in terms of level design. Right now you basically use Trip as a distraction to get around turrets. The other events with Trip are mostly handled via on-rail set pieces like the car, where she's kind of doing her own thing in a mostly automated way. Give Trip more abilities that you can use to influence the level. The problem is that in terms of the game, mechs start out by being scary, but they just end up being another everyday thing you see at the end. You know, once you scan the dog, you can suddenly fight them without issues, whereas you had to run from them before. So I think you need to keep up that dynamic throughout the runtime. Keep the mechs scary, and keep making you use Trip in interesting ways to navigate. Honestly, that's all I got. I'm so disinterested in Enslaved that it's really hard to think of ways to improve it. It's genuinely better than Heavenly Sword, but I don't think it excels at anything, making it just kind of mediocre. I went in fully expecting to hate it, and while I was pleasantly surprised that it wasn't completely terrible, it also just wasn't anything impressive. It's not bad enough to give a definitive no, and not good enough for a definitive yes. So I'm gonna go with a no on this one, mainly because there are so many other better options in this genre. Games that have either better action, better characters, better level design, or just a lot more fun and engaging to play. If the story didn't take a huge nosedive and change gears, and the quality that's in the first few hours kept up for the entire runtime, and it didn't throw in this too deep for you ending, it would have been a lot easier to put up with it and recommend it. As it stands, like I said, it's just not noteworthy. I would say it's probably the baseline for acceptable, and when something's just good enough, that's not really worthy of a recommendation.